Hello, everyone. Welcome to our final day of Axios House here in Dubai at COP28. I'm Naila Boudou. I host our newly launched podcast, One Big Thing. This evening, we're going to be talking about carbon management's role in addressing the climate crisis. But our first guest hails from the Cayman Islands and is an expert in climate resiliency. Please welcome to the stage Lisa Hurlston McKenzie, the Senior Policy Officer of Environment and Resiliency for the Ministry of Sustainability and Climate Resilience. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me in this beautiful location.
Yes.
Thank you.
As I keep saying to everyone, thank you for leaving the blue zone to come here. So today's event obviously is focused on carbon capture, but I wanted to start by having you help us set the scene for what's at stake if efforts like this aren't successful. When we think about the effects of climate change being felt around the world, perhaps nowhere more keenly than small island nation states. And when we zero in on Latin America and the Caribbean, more than 1 million people were internally displaced because of disasters worsened by climate change, and that was just in 2021. And so it's really important to hear sort of your voice of a small island developing state. And I just wanted to start with that. Just when we think about the new data that was just released before COP, also not very encouraging, showing that by 2100, a significant portion of land in the Cayman Islands, but also in the Bahamas, Turks and Caicos, we're thinking of all of that being submerged. So I just wanted to first start with that and ask you how you all are receiving that information.
Well, I think you've done a pretty good job of setting the scene. And in terms of receiving that information, it's probably not anything new. It just sort of reinforces what we already knew. Although we now have those actual statistics that we can really work on developing our own policies as well as getting the message out there to the global community. But in terms of us being in Hurricane Alley, what we call Hurricane Alley, we have the experience of Hurricane Ivan in 2004, singed in our memory, call it Ivan the Terrible, because in the matter of a 24-hour period, we had 183% of our GDP pretty much wiped out. That translated at the time for the population that we had in the islands, the 3 islands, on average something like US $75,000 a person, which is a down payment for a house, which is a luxury car, and to rebuild from that was substantial, but we did it. We made it through. Fast forward now 20 years later, we're on the top 30 list within the Caribbean for structural vulnerability, not so much economic or environmental, but certainly structural vulnerability, as well as what you mentioned, the slow onset events that we have to, that we're looking forward to, which by 2080, if the projections hold, and we're looking at a high emission scenario, it would be something on order of 16% of our land mass, which for all 3 islands is about a 1.5 size the times of Washington, D.C., would be permanently underwater. And, that's a very sobering environment to live within those islands, make decisions for your family. Obviously, 2080 is quite a long time away, and some of us may not be around at that time, but we're looking at the future. We're looking at the future of our next generation and then some of whom are here with us in Dubai at COP28, our young people, our youth delegation, that's totally immersed in all of this, very concerned about their future. Many of them here and at home suffering major eco-anxiety and climate anxiety for what this really means for the future of them to remain in their homeland, to bring up their own children in the place that, that they know and love. And does it mean that we are looking at some populations in the small islands are looking at being climate migrants or climate refugees ourselves, even though we're from a jurisdiction that most people think as, being very high income and be able to absorb these types of impacts. But vulnerability is vulnerability when you're sitting at 7.5 feet on average above sea level.
So let's talk about that a little bit. When we think about the GDP of the Cayman Islands, people might, ask about loss and damage and your eligibility for that. But also, you all have the further complicating aspect of being an overseas territory. So can you first I'm just sort of curious your reaction to the loss and damage announcements that we've had so far, but then how you're feeling about it personally for the Cayman Islands.
Well, definitely for other small islands around the world. I'm very pleased for them, as well as other vulnerable countries and communities. It's a big win, and to have the fund established, and obviously the work begins now to get all the arrangements and mechanisms in place that the money actually goes to where it needs to go, and really rather quickly, as we know, because of the urgency of the situation for many of those communities and islands. For the Cayman Islands itself, yes, because of the constitutional arrangement we have with the United Kingdom, we have never had access to any of the official UNFCCC financing mechanisms, so the GCF, the Adaptation Fund. We've always been locked out of that. And we're hoping that through a wider overseas territories delegation that's here at this COP, that we'll be able to move the needle on that a bit for the loss and damage fund. But we've also had some interesting things happen over the last few days in the side events, where we've understood that there's perhaps other vehicles that the loss and damage fund will be able to filter down to us in terms of things like risk insurance and risk pools that we do have access to from a government standpoint, and that, with that, along with crowding in some private finance, where there's those gaps, that we'll be able to better plan for where these monies can go as needs arise, or as the needs that we have identified can sit comfortably through those mechanisms.
Let's talk about some of those needs and sort of how that dovetails with you all being in the process of formally adopting your first national climate strategy. What are you all focusing on?
We're focusing on everything, because climate change leaves nothing untouched. It's moved, obviously, from being a squarely scientific and environmental issue to where it needs to be spoken about. It's a developmental issue, and obviously when you layer in the Sustainable Development Goals and just general objectives for a country, you always have to look at everything through a climate change lens. And even in the Cayman Islands, we have communities and vulnerable groups, not just physically vulnerable, but economically vulnerable, socially vulnerable, and there's always a climate change layering to all of those issues. And whether you're talking about adaptation or mitigation or resiliency, when you are working at a small island level, those lines are very blurred, particularly when it comes to the discussion of climate finance, because a lot of what would be mitigation squarely in terms of energy efficiency, energy security more broadly, those are also resiliency issues for us. Those are adaptations for us too when it comes to use of natural capital. And the blue carbon discussion, for example, it's generally thought of as servicing both objectives. And on a Grand Cayman is 76 square miles, so one project that might be servicing a particular type of health benefit in a community doesn't stop there at that district boundary. It's in essence a national win for the country if you can get those policies and those initiatives going for the benefit of all.
How hard has it been to get mitigation included in this conversation?
The climate change strategy is very much supported broadly, but we did have some issues come up where people were wondering, again, is mitigation more of a global agenda and not something that the Cayman Islands necessarily needs to focus on? But when you have a discussion with these individuals or stakeholders and you explain to them pretty much what we've just discussed, that a lot of the policy mechanisms and the initiatives that you would be looking at trying to implement, they cross both boundaries, and it also ends up being an immediate as well as a future cost of living issue, which nobody can really argue with, and the cost of living is extremely high, I would say worldwide since the pandemic. And again, that's climate change as well. Climate change is going to continue to be more expensive for us to adapt to enhance that resiliency, as well as when it comes to post-disaster recovery.
So we talked about this earlier, but people might see the GDP per capita of the Cayman Islands and might think, why do they need help? What's your response to that?
Well, as I said before, when you sit at 7.5 feet above sea level on average, and you've had an event like a Hurricane Ivan, which we know is going to come again, and we always said that Hurricane Ivan is the great equalizer, because on an island that size, you can have a very well-to-do community sitting right next to, those that are perhaps struggling a little bit or underserved, and you're all losing electricity, you're all losing water. You can't get, by roads covered with sand or debris or what have you. So it's the greatest equalizer ever.
You're also the director of a local carbon offset program. What are your biggest challenges there?
Our biggest challenge we've had several challenges, but I think our biggest challenge has been in terms of getting verifiable credits, having a standard or a protocol that really works at our scale, or really works for our scale. That's been one issue. The other issue has been really trying to get the scientific assessments done so that it can be really quite credible. A third issue has been just people understanding that there are different types of credits, and in many respects, some people don't care at all that it's not necessarily verifiable at this point in time. So we've had a lot of successes with what we've just tended to view as philanthropic donations, and it all goes, we take no money, it all goes to the National Trust for the Cayman Islands. They have a land reserve fund, and within that land reserve fund, there's a dedicated fund earmarked for wetlands. So we can say that we're directly affecting change there and creating more protections for our coastal mangroves in particular, to have our adaptation and service on a very small portion, but service that mitigation benefit there as well.
So this is your second COP. We were just talking about that backstage. What are you taking back to the Caymans? What's the message that you feel like you've gotten here?
I think from COP 15 in Copenhagen, which was my first COP, we as an overseas territories delegation have really come together and coalesced around certain things, but particularly climate finance this year, and as you spoke about, really trying to understand if and how we can access these funds, particularly the loss and damage fund. But I would also take away how everything has just grown from one COP to the next, and it's just become even more difficult to split your time and decide where you want to go, so you have to be very strategic, especially with a very small delegation that we have. But I would also say that we're very much looking forward to what's going to be the result of the global stocktake, because that's going to significantly affect, us and how quickly we need to move in terms of our own national strategies and getting ourselves sorted out in terms of our resiliency, but also to where we will need to be able to go to find those monies to help us where we will have the shortfalls, which we know we will have, and that we can't, adapt our way out of this. There will be significant losses and damages, but we would hope that if it's not through any time quite soon in terms of access to these official funds, that there are these other mechanisms that we're learning about and where we can best use and utilize private capital, which as a financial services sector, you would think that that's something that we should be able to leverage.
Well, thank you for taking the time for us and coming out here, and I know it's a very busy schedule. Lisa Hurlston McKenzie, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Up next, our View from the Top moderator, Axios publisher Nicholas Johnston.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Nicholas Johnston. I'm the publisher of Axios. Thanks so much for joining us on a beautiful evening like this. This is our third day here at COP. We wouldn't be able to do this without all of you here joining it, and we certainly wouldn't be able to do it without the support of our partners. So I have a huge debt of gratitude for the folks at ClearPath for making tonight's conversation possible. And so I'm very happy to welcome up to the stage for a View from the Top conversation the CEO of ClearPath, Rich Powell. Rich Powell, come on down. Welcome to Axios House. Let's start maybe back closer to our hometowns in D.C. For carbon management, there's been a lot of support in Congress for tax incentives. It was in the infrastructure bill. Starting from there, what's driving that?
Well, first, huge thanks for having us. Huge thanks for hosting this really important conversation. I think carbon management is probably the most bipartisan place in the U.S. climate policy conversation right now, across the Energy Act of 2020 and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and even the Inflation Reduction Act. Probably no technology received more investment than this. And I think that's probably, one, it starts with the science, right? So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and others have found that this is the need to have technology. So we need this to work at scale and at a reasonable cost if we've got any hope of stabilizing global temperatures and avoiding everything Lisa just talked about with sea level rise and loss of the small island states. And it's a technology where we could conceivably retrofit a lot of our existing infrastructure and frankly keep a lot of existing people employed in big parts, certainly of the US economy. And so I think it's been really appealing across the aisle.
And so a key element of that investment element in the technology is finding that price point. Tell us where, from your viewpoint, we are in that arc of trying to figure out, like, has the investment reached a level where the economics make sense? When do they begin to make more sense, and what's ahead for that?
Well, I think the investments are starting to speak for themselves. So in the US, this was a banner year for investment in carbon management technology. I think we'll see at the end of the year, but I think the record will show that after more gas, which is replacing coal, after more solar, carbon management will be the third largest set of investments in the US economy, which I think indicates that the business models and the price points are emerging.
So that's driven by the economics, almost a tipping point, saying like now it's worth pouring more money into this because we're getting enough out of it.
That's right. So we've got significant, we've had the 45Q tax incentive, but that's now significantly more lucrative. We have major corporate commitments across the space. And we have significant cost share programs, for example, from the Department of Energy in carbon dioxide removal, in point source carbon capture, in the whole suite of things.
The technology is not without its critics, though. You'll be down at COP for the next couple of days. You'll probably run into people who are not as enthusiastic about it as you. What is your message to them? How do you win them over?
Well, we start with carbon dioxide removals. So I would argue that there may well already be too much CO2 in the atmosphere, that we're going to decide that we need to already start drawing it down. And if you just look at the inevitability that year on year we keep increasing CO2 in the atmosphere, we should slow that down and stop it as quickly as possible. But we've got all of this CO2 in
Some
the atmosphere.
net reduction needs to be in the
We've got
equation.
a new net reduction. We've got a new net reduction. So I think you start with that. That's just a reality. And then beyond that, there's lots of sectors of our economy. Take cement and concrete, for example. We just don't have many better options than carbon capture, use and storage to deal with a lot of the emissions from concrete and cement right now. I hope we'll have breakthrough technologies where people completely reimagine how to make cement and concrete. Some of those are on the drawing board in the lab scale, but usually they're making blocks of concrete about this big. And we make billions of tons of this stuff every year around the world. We need solutions to retrofit and control the existing industrial emissions.
So as you are, and as you continue to work to get people over to that side, then what is the next piece of that puzzle as far as doing this at scale? Because I remember, though, as you just said, like if we're having to get net reduction, that's a large amount of carbon that needs to be taken out. What needs to ramp up this?
Well, one thing that hugely needs to ramp up is the underlying infrastructure to store all this CO2. And so that means we're going to have a lot of places to store it. So we're going to have a lot of wells and sequestration sites around the world. We're going to have a lot of pipes and pipelines to move the stuff around everywhere. We're going to have the enabling policy regimes in the US and around the world to do all of that. And there's a lot of work left to do there. There's a lot of work on regulatory reform. There's a lot of work on getting the enabling infrastructure stood up that will support this whole network of technologies.
I mean, you're going to be walking the halls of COP probably with some of the members of Congress who are going to be flying into town after they're done voting. Many of them will probably support this. The message that you'll be giving, enforcing with them and bringing to others then is to do what? Is it more of that kind of all of the above approach that requires additional investments, not just supporting the actual technology of that, but all the pieces, I guess, around it?
Well, first, important to note, I think we have the largest ever delegation of U.S. members of Congress coming to the COP this year, and certainly the largest ever bipartisan delegation coming. So we've got Republicans from the Energy and Commerce Committee that are leading a very large delegation, I think more than 20 total members coming over. So it's terrific to see this sort of bipartisan consensus that we ought to be here, that the U.S. ought to be at the table at COP, that there's a problem worth solving, and that we should have a discussion about that. And then in particular, as we're talking to those members about the next steps going forward, frankly, one of the biggest things that we need to enable this is permitting reform. So we need it to be easier for people to develop all of this enabling infrastructure. We need it to be easier and faster and more certain for people to do things like cite and sequester CO2. The Environmental Protection Agency, for example, has to issue permits for people to put the CO2 under the ground, and this EPA has not yet issued one of those permits. So we need to speed up that process.
I want to circle right back to what the U.S. does, maybe on our way back home, but I want to take a very brief detour to the role coal plays in all of this. It's probably one of the most intractable problems, one of the dirtiest fuels, used so much in widespread around the world. How does the prevalence of that factor into how you make this argument and what kind of investment should be made in carbon management?
We can't escape coal at the moment. So large parts of the world, led by China, but also with India and Indonesia, they have massive coal reserves. They're very committed to developing and electrifying their own economies and building heavy infrastructure and industry in their economies. China has built a coal fleet twice the size of the entire U.S. power fleet. So 2 terawatts. The whole U.S. power fleet is 1 terawatt. And some of that will retire naturally, and some of that will be replaced with renewables and with nuclear and other zero carbon sources. But if we don't have a technology, and I'm glad we're going to hear from Svante a little later on in the conversation, if we don't have a technology or a suite of technologies that can retrofit some big part of all those coal plants, many of which are brand new. The average age of a lot of these plants are 12 years old. If we don't have something that can control the carbon emissions from those, I don't see how the carbon math works. I don't see how we solve the equation.
So let's come back home before we have to wrap this up. You touched on this a little bit, but with those investments made in the United States, what needs to happen next? I mean, you mentioned permitting reform. What are the other things at the top of the list for you for implementation?
So absolutely permitting reform, absolutely a number of enabling things to the Department of Energy. So they've received this huge injection of resources from the bipartisan infrastructure law, for example. Now they've got to select projects and get dollars out the door. They've started that process with some of the carbon dioxide removal technologies, and so they've selected sites in Texas and Louisiana to get started on that. They've got a next round of this that they've got to do for power plants and industrial sites. They've got to get that out the door. They also have to start making investments in some hubs and some suites of enabling infrastructure, pipeline networks and whatnot. So that's another major
The
priority.
legislation, maybe, that was the easy part. Now you have to do the work.
Yeah, it's really hard. It's hard to do it at the scale and the speed that we need it to happen. The Department of Energy is rising to the moment. They're hugely staffing up. They're making a lot of smart choices about these things, and there's not a lot of margin for error. And they have a mixed track record in the past of executing really well on big projects, especially in this space.
So we're about to get the hook here. Our tradition at Axios is to end on a one fun thing. We've made that a one Dubai thing here. This is our first time here. This is your first newbie?
Fifth time.
Fifth time here? Okay, so for us people here who just got off the plane in Dubai, what do we got to do before we go home?
This is a bit of a stretch because it's in the Emirates, not in Dubai, but people should go down the road to Abu Dhabi where there is a Louvre that they've built in association with the original Louvre. And in that Louvre, you can see the first map of the entire world.
That's a good tourist
You
trip.
should see that.
Excellent. Rich, thanks so much for being here, and thanks to ClearPath for making today possible.
Thanks for having me.
Welcoming back to the stage, me again, Naila Boodoo.
Hi again. Well, Rich teed that perfectly up for us. I'd like to welcome our next guest, a leader in the carbon capture industry, Savante CEO Claude Letourneau. Thanks for being here, Claude. So before we get into all of the work that you all are doing, first, maybe we should just start with understanding a little bit more about the role carbon capture has been playing, because we've heard so much criticism about how we haven't accelerated decarbonization of the industry enough.
Yeah, well, first of all, Rich, thank you for the sponsorship. Great place. I feel like I'm in LA here on the movie star. So anyway, this is great. So I will start first by explaining what CO2 is. So if you breathe, you exhale CO2. You exhale CO2. So you breathe oxygen and then you release CO2. So all of you are emitters of CO2, first of all. Nature was designed for us to deal with this by having plants who take that CO2 and reconvert it to oxygen so we can basically breathe. Oceans are also absorbing the CO2. But for the last 125 years, we've been emitting CO2 from man-made because of the Industrial Revolution, where we're starting to use more and more fossil fuels and other kinds of things to make steel, cement. We're breaking up the rock, and by breaking the rock, you create CO2. So we need more and more cement to build all these buildings. Steel is the same thing. We want pulp and paper. It emits CO2 in the process as well. So man-made has been producing CO2 going up in the atmosphere, but Mother Nature was able to cope for half of that CO2. And the rest goes up in the atmosphere. And we're growing the population now from 8 billion to 10 billion. So Mother Nature was over-designed, but now it cannot cope anymore with the growth of human, basically, on this planet. So what we're trying to do, basically, is to find an engineering solution to capture that CO2 so that we can get a support for our plants and ocean. And we're looking at a carbon capture plant, let's say about 1 million ton per year of capacity, that will do the job of 8 million trees. So that's the engineering solution that we're trying to do to give a boost to the nature so we can cope with that excess CO2 that we have from the atmosphere. So to answer your question, up till now, we have 40 plants of 1 million ton managed capturing CO2. But it was done with natural CO2, meaning that when you open up your stove at home, some of you have natural gas. Well, that natural gas is coming from the ground. And in most of cases, it has CO2 mixed with it that comes from the ground. So oil and gas has been separating that CO2, and that's the portion of the 40 plants you see today. In addition, we have been looking at natural CO2 reservoir that you see, for example, in Texas. And the oil and gas said, if we take that natural CO2 from the ground and we pipe it back into a depleted oil reservoir, we will be able to get the last drop of oil. They ran out of natural CO2. That's the 40 plants. To have 25% of the excess CO2 that's been managed by mankind, we need 10 gigaton out of 40. That's 10,000 plants of 1 million ton that needs to be built over the next 30 years. So we need to build within the next, starting this week, 2 plants a week. We're going to miss this week. 2 plants next week. We're going to make next week. And sometimes we're going to have to catch up and build these 10,000 plants. So that's what we're trying to do.
So that's what you're trying to do. The scope of this is 10,000 plants. You're at 40. Explain for us first just sort of how this technology works that Svante has.
Yeah, first of all, the oil and gas industry and doing the 40 plants have been using a technology they know, which is gas to liquid, and they know how to process the CO2 out of it. So we have a totally different approach. We have one coming from the tech industry, similar to batteries. We basically make a powder, which has a unique property to catch the CO2, and we lay this thing on a very thin film. And then we stack these filters, these sheets to make a filter, and that filter goes into a rotating equipment that basically catch and release the CO2. So 1 million ton capacity is about the size of that wheel on the back, on its back. We need 10,000 of those. So we're making the filters, and we're making the machine that goes into capturing these capture plant for industrial processes. Our filter is also designed to be able to do the catch and release from the air, from the atmosphere. In that case, we have a different sorbent that we use, which is the magic powder, and we do these filters for Climeworks, who's our partner in doing direct air capture. So you heard Rick talking about direct air capture. So we do both removing it from the atmosphere or avoiding going out in the atmosphere. That's what we call industrial point source.
And can you share with us just sort of what 2023 has looked like for Svante and what your hopes are for 2024?
So we've been at it for 16 years. I came on board about 6 years ago. We were about 25 people in Vancouver. We're based in Vancouver, Canada. And we now have 300 people. We've raised $500 million, and we're on our way of commissioning a first factory to make the filters, because nobody makes these filters in the world. So that factory will be able to do capacity of filters for 10 plants a year. Remember, we need to go to 2 plants a week, 100 a year. That's factory number 1 that we're building as we speak. We've designed a machine that is half the size of the one you see behind me. And that rotary machine will allow customers to say, okay, this is de-risked now. And we're doing feasibility study and to get to an investment decision by the end of next year, early 25, so that we can start deploying our technology in the marketplace.
And I mean, I guess the obvious question after everything you've just said is, can you do this faster? Like, what's the strategy for that?
Well, my management team thinks I'm not an easy guy to deal with, so I'm impatient. So for us, we have 3 things that we're dealing with. So first of all, we need to establish carbon management as a necessity. And so far, all of what you hear in the media is polarization. It's one or the other. Renewable or something else, no fossil fuel, whatever. We need all of them on steroids, all of them. We don't want to slow down renewable. We want them to be accelerated. But the rate of deployment of renewable will be so great that they won't necessarily be able to cope at that rate. So carbon management is a way of addressing this thing at much faster. So necessity. And I hope this COP will establish carbon management as a necessity. Second is you need to scale. So we're building a factory as we speak. We have no purchase order from customers, and we're spending $125 million in a factory to make the filters. Make it, and they'll come. We're all in. And third, rapid deployment. I used to term it internally as we need to work at a ludicrous speed. Make one, learn from it, make a second one, make mistake, learn from it, and do another one. By the time you get to the third one, we'll be pretty good, and then we'll get the 10,000 done afterward.
Let's talk about the first thing that you mentioned, which is that there is a perception that carbon capture is not a pillar of a green transition. So how do you want that narrative to be changed? But also, how do you address skepticism from outside the industry about the work that you're doing?
So you said something important. You said the green transition. Most people call this the green energy transition. I believe it's the green industrial transition. We need to start managing our waste. We've been throwing the CO2 as a byproduct of industrial activity at no cost. Now we're seeing the effect of it, and we need to manage our waste. It's similar to the waste management industry. 125 years ago, we established a waste management industry because you could smell and see your rubbish. You cannot smell and see CO2. So we need to manage waste. Somebody needs to pick up your rubbish, transport it, and landfill. Somebody needs to pick up your CO2 from your industrial plants, move it, and store it on the ground, put it back to where it came from. So that industry is basically as big as 10,000 plants. What does it look like? Yes, it looks like, well, you all flew in big Airbus and Boeing on the way in, yes? So it took 30 years to build 25,000 of these commercial aircraft. 30 years, 25,000. Each one of them is about 200 to 300 million. So a capture plant of 1 million is about the same investment. So we have 30 years to do about the same. So I would like to fly these airplanes, you need engines, yes? How many companies are doing engines? GE, Pratt & Whitney, and Rolls-Royce. How many companies are doing commercial aircraft? Airbus and Boeing. This is the size of the industry that's going to deploy it in carbon management. There will be a few people making capture plants or removal plants, and there'll be a few players making filters or media to capture that CO2. I'd like to be the Rolls-Royce or the GE of the industry.
When are you expecting to be at commercial scale then, as we've sort of laid out where you're
So
at the moment?
we've done several pilots with some of our partners, both in Canada and US, and we are looking now to build commercial size plant that will be in the range of 200,000 ton, 400,000 ton on its way to 1 million ton. So we have 3 or 4 of these projects that will basically be what we call FID, so decision to invest, by mid-25 with deployment in 26, 27.
When you think about, we talked before you came to COP, and I wonder, now that you're here and we've sort of seen the news that's been trickling out, obviously we're not at any specific outcomes yet, what are you seeing accomplished that is exciting to you that's been happening here?
Okay, this is my first COP. And every time I read in the paper the other COP, it took until the last second of COP or last day of COP to get anything declaration.
Or past the deadline, you're right, yeah.
Okay, so in this case, day one, boom, boom, announcement, things done. So somebody from the industry came from the oil and gas, but somebody from the industry basically called other industrial players. He called the financial partners and banks that he deals with, and he says, what's the objective in the next by 2030? And then he went to politics and government and says, this is the plan. And that was done. So that's a good thing. It means to me that now they're accountable, the industrial sector, primarily the oil and gas, who put their neck out to say, we will do this, we will deploy more renewable, we will deploy carbon capture, and we will have a very specific objective of doing it by 2030. So I hope all of us here make them accountable and track them year by year, because that's what needs to be done.
And when we think about what you worry most about, challenges and achieving all the things we've talked about, how much is it around perception and understanding the role that carbon capture will play versus very practical things like access to capital? What's your biggest worry?
I worry about the public perception, or at least the narrative that's been promoted throughout the world in the media, and we need to rebalance the polarization that we have about the solution for climate. So that's one. People associate carbon management or carbon capture as maintaining the life of oil and gas. Well, that CO2 to go back needs the expertise of somebody who knows how to extract gas from Earth. So I think the oil and gas will play a key role, or people from the oil and gas setting up new companies are basically going to be managing putting the CO2 back into the atmosphere. And then this will create a new industry of capturing. And this $2 trillion required to deploy just carbon capture plants for 20% of the CO2 management. The rest of the problem with renewable and EVs and hydrogen is 118 trillion. So this is the one that gives you more bang for your buck. So I worry about the acceptability of carbon management and storage.
So yeah, but how do you make it more acceptable? Because there is the reality that this is with the oil and gas industry, this is fossil fuels.
Well, I can only control what I can control. I cannot control the way the oil and gas will behave and explain these things. But I think we need to find time next year. That's why I'm here. I'm trying to gauge different people from different backgrounds looking at this thing and trying to help explain what it is, like I've just did for the last half an hour. And when people understand what we're trying to do here, they'll understand that it's not the source of the CO2 that's the problem. It's the emission. So manage your emission and problem is solved.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I want to thank you very much for being with us. Savante CEO Claude Letourneau, thank you.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Axios senior climate reporter, Andrew Friedman.
Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew Friedman, senior climate reporter at Axios. I co-write the Generate newsletter that comes out every day that my colleague in DC is currently sending out without my help. Our final guest in this session is no stranger to Axios and no stranger to the climate policy community. She's been involved in climate change and environmental policy in the U.S. State Department and the White House. Now she's the Chief Sustainability Officer for Microsoft. Please welcome Melanie Nakagawa. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for having me and for filling me with great treats in the green room.
We try to score well on green room food.
100%.
Yes. So I know at Microsoft, one of the three pillars of your sustainability mission is to accelerate innovation. Can you talk a bit about how you're doing that? What projects have come out from that focus, are forthcoming, or that you've recently announced that you're really excited about, especially in the carbon management space?
Of course. So let's put this into context. Where we are in innovation is because it stems from our core, which is our sustainability commitments. So in 2020, we announced ambitious commitments to be carbon negative, water positive, zero waste, and to protect ecosystems all by 2030. And to that first goal of being carbon negative, this is exactly where carbon management comes into play. Our carbon negative goal includes our focus around carbon removal and making markets where markets haven't existed to date. Also, when we launched these goals, we also launched our $1 billion Climate Innovation Fund. And so if you think about them both as sort of two sides of a carbon management coin, the first is how do you rapidly reduce emissions and remove the rest, and how do you also invest in the technology solutions we're gonna need? So in this space, in carbon removal, we have been the largest corporate purchaser every year so far, although we're really excited for someone to come take that mantle from us. in carbon removal. And we're really excited to do things such as direct air capture. We're working in spaces like on reforestation, and it's just a really exciting space to be a participant because I think it shows where corporate leadership matters.
You know, AI has been a big topic here at Axios, Axios House especially. Obviously, across COP28 as a whole, it's really the first time that it's kind of burst forth on the COP scene, and it's obviously a big part of the focus at Microsoft. Can you talk a bit about the role Microsoft sees AI playing in carbon management when thinking about solutions?
Of course, and actually I heard as of 2 or 3 a.m. this morning, negotiation text concluded that also was on this topic of AI and how to do this towards technology solutions. So for Microsoft, AI is a really important accelerator to sustainability progress. And the way we see that is AI has some pretty amazing superpowers. It can take really complex, multiple sources of information and simplify it. It can also accelerate the discovery of new materials, which is particularly relevant to the carbon removal space. And it also has the opportunity to create some game-changing new breakthroughs as well. And so if you think about that, we're seeing AI being used in things such as grid decarbonization, but you're also seeing AI being used in how do you scale something like low-carbon concrete? How do you scale new building materials for this world in this space? So again, this is another area where using our Climate Innovation Fund, we've invested in companies like Carbon Cure to really help scale that marketplace. But we've also done things such as look at doing procurement contracts with some of these large facilities as well.
Does the advent of AI and the central focus of it at Microsoft simultaneously make your job somewhat more challenging on the sustainability front from the compute power issue and managing the energy resources, water resources, and how are you dealing with that as a CSO?
This is a great question, and I will give a plug for a much longer white paper that everyone here should read. About 2 weeks ago, Microsoft released a white paper titled Accelerating Sustainability with AI. And in this white paper, and the reason why I'm raising it is we had a 5-point playbook on how do you actually use AI to accelerate sustainability progress, but we also have a whole section in there to talk about what are the resource implications of AI. And when we unpack it, first and foremost, when Microsoft grows, we want to make sure we're growing our data, growing our footprint, as well as growing net new clean energy. This has led us to become one of the largest corporate purchasers of renewable power to date. We've got 19 gigawatts in 21 markets contracted for in clean power. So we want to make sure we're growing our footprint, we're growing this compute in a way that is done in a low carbon, carbon-free way. We also released a paper yesterday on nuclear power and where we see technologies like nuclear fission as well as advanced reactors play in this growth of net new carbon-free power so that when we grow, it's growing with zero carbon into the marketplace. We also have in our targets 100, 100, 0. We want to make sure that 100% of the electrons, 100% of the time are coming from carbon-free sources of power. So we're taking that really responsibly. We're trying to really make sure that our growth is done in a way that is sustainable. But that's not just it. We're also looking at the models, how the AI models are trained, how they're built. We want to make sure that they are maximizing its efficiency. One of the data points that struck me was that over the last, I believe it's decade, we have grown compute power by 9x, but energy has only increased 10%. And so you're looking at companies like ours that are going to grow this compute power, but want to do it in a way where we're not necessarily linearly growing the energy as well. And the last piece is the third part of what is the AI doing? So we're building these models, we're doing things, but AI can do things like rapidly bring on clean energy into the grid. In the UK, there's a company that's been working with the UK energy utility called Line Vision. They've shown that they can use AI to decongest existing transmission lines by 60%, bringing on 600 megawatts of offshore power onto an existing transmission line. So again, these are just incredible opportunities for AI itself to rapidly accelerate our progress.
And one question that occurs to me as you just mentioned nuclear, like Microsoft has a pretty ambitious vision for tapping into advanced nuclear reactors. Didn't you have a deal for nuclear fusion, which is still on many companies, just getting on many companies' radar screen really as a realistic option. Are the provisions in the IRA affecting that vision at all, considering there are some incentives for advanced nuclear? Or where does this stem from, this enthusiasm for this as a potential solution? I mean, co-locating nuclear reactors in data centers, for example, at some point. Where, I'm trying to figure out where this came from, because when I started writing about these deals, I was like, oh, whoa, they're thinking very differently than some other companies are, and they seem to be ahead of the curve.
So where it came from was we need a multi-technology approach to how to meet our growth as a business and how to make sure we're meeting clean energy needs and demands going forward. And when you think about that, how much energy is required just generally as a world, you have latest reports from the International Energy Agency saying our growth as countries are going to require increased energy. We also thought Microsoft as a planetary citizen, how are we also contributing to the growth in energy? And we realized we needed a multi-technology approach. It couldn't just be wind or solar, but you needed other firm resources of power. And then incentivized by our 100-100-0 commitment and our carbon negative goals, we also knew we had to go find carbon-free sources of that power. So that really stemmed our interest in all types of solutions, including advanced reactor technology and nuclear fission and fusion energy technologies as well. And the company you're thinking of is Helion Power, where we signed a PPA with them earlier this year. And what's exciting about this space is yesterday we were at this panel discussion where we talked about all the progress, even just the last, call it 7 days. It's like dog years here, but the last 7 days, where I forget how many number of countries all signed up to tripling nuclear power on the grid by 2050, I think is the target that was set. So this is not a Microsoft initiative. You've got countries around the world who are interested in nuclear power, raising their hands and saying they're setting goals to triple the amount of advanced nuclear capacity in their systems by a certain timeline, and we want to help be able to support that. And that's out there, and the U.S. government made a series of announcements as well. But I was on a panel with the Ghanaians and the Canadians and the Americans, so it's great to see these conversations in these contexts at the COP negotiations taking a much broader berth of topics. It's not just wind and solar, but today's whole topic is on carbon management. We had nuclear discussions yesterday, biodiversity before that. So I really like the broadening of the aperture that's happening at COP28.
Microsoft has been a leading investor in carbon removal projects. Just in the last 3 months, Microsoft, thank you.
I know.
Thank you. Microsoft and the direct air capture company Heirloom recently inked a big carbon removal deal, as you know. Bloomberg reported yesterday that Microsoft has agreed to purchase as many as 1.5 million carbon removal credits through 2032 through a Brazilian startup that is working to reforest the Amazon, or at least preserve the Amazon. What trends do you see taking place in the carbon removal space that may be nature-based or other solutions that you're starting to see or maybe hear about for the first time at COP?
So Mambach, the one you just described, that it was announced yesterday, is in the Brazilian rainforest. It's a Brazilian reforestation project to help farmers as well. And that's a nature-based solution that is coming into the market as well. And I think there's a range. You have, not to get too technical, but this seems like the right crowd to get technical.
I think you're fine, yeah.
Okay. You can go low, medium, and high durability solutions that are out there. We have a portfolio mix of all of them, and often in the nature base, they're currently more in the low durability scenario versus the engineered carbon, which is high durability. But most of these companies that are starting to take these commitments around removal, like Microsoft, are looking at a portfolio approach across all of them. And again, the whole idea here is we need to show demand and supply. We're happy as Microsoft to be someone who's stepping up to talk about the demand and really working and investing in these companies on the supply side. And we're excited to work with so many other companies that are doing the same to help grow this market. And you're gonna see it grow in nature-based, you're gonna see it grow in engineered and the range. But you really definitely need this balance between demand growing for this as well as supply. And this has really led to why Microsoft has put out 3 white papers describing in great detail how we think about carbon removal, how we're contracting for it, the types of methodologies and the data we're applying to it, and the kind of contracts we sign.
why is DAC, direct air capture, and other emerging technologies that may not work at scale yet, well suited for Microsoft to pursue, yet, Al Gore was here yesterday. He harshly criticized oil and gas companies for trying to rely on DAC and CCS to try to, continue to spew emissions into the atmosphere. What sets up that criticism apart from what Microsoft is doing and what other tech companies are doing, trying to move into this space? Because I think that if enough of that criticism gets across to the public, you may actually have a perception challenge.
This is where education and unpacking and unconflating, if that's even a word, matters. So you have CCS, CCUS, DAC, the alphabet CDR. There's an alphabet soup that's out there. What I would say is when you think about carbon dioxide removal in this market, think about it's called the gold standard. It looks at the life cycle assessment, the life cycle emissions of the entire project in direct air capture, for instance, where it's actually a carbon negative approach and in that it's not furthering the advancement of something that is going to increase emissions. So that first and foremost is really important to make sure that we're talking about technologies that are either straight out, sucking carbon out of the atmosphere in limestone rocks, and those rocks are then being turned into cement, concrete, permanently gone away. Then there's other technologies like enhanced oil recovery, which is traditionally when I started coming to these negotiations, CCUS was the topic at COP12. So I just think we really want to make sure we separate out what we're talking about in each of these spaces, because I worry that the conflating, that this is all one thing. What you described, the Mombak project, the Brazilian forest project, which is in the kind of CDR space, is not an oil and gas company doing CCUS, and yet they're probably both under the umbrella of carbon dioxide removal. So that's really where I think this aspect of education and awareness raising of what are companies doing, being incredibly transparent about what types of projects we're investing in and what is that life cycle of those projects and applying those methodologies. That's where I think and I hope that the public recognizes which companies are trying to do the right thing for what the IPCC says and which companies are not.
Yeah. Well, I thank you. Unfortunately, our time is up.
Smart brevity at work here.
It is. And I know you've done probably about 30 panels in the past week. So I really thank you for being here. It's a pleasure. Thank you for joining us at Axios House. Thank you to our sponsor, ClearPath. And please stick around. Our next reception, I believe, starts at 6:30 p.m. Have a drink, have some food before then. And the next one will be on decarbonizing aviation.